Audiobook Always Visible, Another Prayer for the Dying Horror Genre, by Vitaly Ivolginsky. Based on the motion picture Omen IV, The Awakening. 13th chapter. "Oh girl," the inspector said quietly, "why are you leading me into your obscurity?" These words were addressed to emptiness, for Galbraith did not expect to hear an answer to them. He couldn't get it anyway. Delia Yonce was buried at Riverview Cemetery, not far from the grave of First Portland's female mayor. Her funeral went unnoticed by the town, because no one cared about some pharmaceutist's daughter. Nobody wrote in the Asian Reporter a note under the X-Actor knife. On her grave not even her most distant relative sat, and especially not one of her classmates came there and asked with tears in their eyes, "Delia, Delia, can you hear your friend?" The only one who truly sympathized with the girl from those gathered at the farewell ceremony was Galbraith himself, who, after standing at the head of her grave for some time, laid a bouquet of dahlias of different colors on her grave and silently walked away, leaving the funeral procession to be tormented by guesses about the connection this gloomy, mustachioed policeman with a deceased. If Galbraith himself had been asked about this, he would have answered them. Was there such a connection at all? Indeed, in his entire life, the inspector saw this little girl only once, when he came to the Yonce family home on the matter of her mother's suicide. But even these short minutes of their meeting were enough to understand that it was on him, Galbraith, that the future fate of this child depended. Alas, a call from Mr. Chief Inspector Scamore then separated them, and he had to leave Delia in the care of an inadequate man from Federal Bureau of Investigation and Dr. Matt McLaren, a kind-hearted but essentially spineless person. Galbraith distracted himself from these sad thoughts and noticed that although it was October outside, through the window of the Clarentone establishment, where he had been standing all this time, shiny silver fir trees were clearly visible. He involuntarily admired them. The decorations were cut out of foil and hung in the same place where the curtains were attached. "I don't argue, it's beautiful, but somehow it's not the season," he said thoughtfully to himself. The inspector opened the door and, entering a small elongated hall, realized that he had not imagined. Not only the facade of the café, but also its interior was completely decorated for Christmas. LED garlands and fir tree cones were hung on the walls and there were toy figures of some animals hanging from the ceiling. The only thing missing was appropriate music, Galbraith thought, and hypothesized that apparently the owners of this establishment were such lazy people that they had forgotten to remove the decorations since last year. He glanced at the counter, then noticed the tables. The inspector went to the very end of the hall, where the order receiving area was located. Sitting down on a small soft sofa at the table, Galbraith put his hands on the table and noticed with some dissatisfaction that besides him and one waitress there was no one else in this room. Apparently, people living in the area knew what awaited them in this cafe and therefore tried to avoid it. While waiting for the girl to deign to pay attention to him, the inspector looked around. Now that he had already gotten used to inappropriate decorations of Clarentone, he was able to pay attention to the high ceilings and rustic scarlet walls. Richly, Galbraith thought, and this circumstance changed his attitude towards the establishment for the better than it had been from the very beginning. He even caught himself thinking that there was something in that on a hot October day sitting in a room that involuntarily transports him several months into the future. 5 minutes later, the waitress, who had previously been running between tables with a white rag, finally deigned to pay attention to Galbraith and approached his table. "Welcome, what's your pleasure?" the blonde girl asked modestly. Galbraith looked up at her. Beautiful, he thought. Her slender figure was emphasized by a light dress that tightly fit her graceful waist and high chest. "Could I see the menu?" he just asked. The waitress handed him a sheet of glossy paper folded in half, and Galbraith thanked him and took the menu in his hands. Having glanced over the contents, he was quite surprised by the small size of the list. Only 2 dishes were indicated in it. He remembered that the taxi driver, recommending this establishment, called it an unfamiliar word, Vanita's restaurant. Apparently, an establishment with a claim to something original, Galbraith thought. Then it could be clear why the interior was decorated out of season. The inspector carefully studied the menu. The first course was a cocktail with the strange name Sagera. Sierra, chain of mountains? Galbraith asked himself. Under the picture of a glass with a thin stem, the ingredients were indicated: cognac, water, sugar, lemon juice. What does it mean? He asked the waitress standing at the table. It's cognac with caramel syrup, she answered with downcast eyes in a gentle voice. Galbraith was quite surprised at such a strange combination of ingredients. This is a very light drink, because the syrup softens the strength of the alcohol, the girl explained. So what, visitors order this slip-slop there? Galbraith was even more surprised. A highly tasty cocktail, the girl said confidently. Try it yourself. Okay, I'll take your word for it, the inspector said and continued to study the menu. In addition to this incomprehensible cocktail, on the inner spread of the glossy paper there was another line: Jantar. Just this name and that's all, no picture, no composition. He didn't even try to understand the meaning of this word. What is this? Galbraith pointed a finger. This is the dish, the waitress answered. It was fairly obvious, but what it represents, the inspector involuntarily began to be irritated by the girl's playful tone. The recipe of Jantar is the trade secret, she answered with dignity. Well, I order everything that's on this menu. Galbraith waved his hand in anger. The waitress made a slight bow and, taking the menu from the table, gave the guest a charming smile and left. The inspector looked after her for a while, and then, again staring ahead, thought that the establishment was very strange. Only 2 dishes, of which one had an idiotic composition, and the second only had its name. Galbraith had a suspicion that the chefs of this establishment were clearly cooking not for clients who almost never came to them, but to satisfy their personal whims. He even felt a wave of cold and sticky sweat run down his back for no apparent reason. 3 minutes later the waitress returned to his table. Here's your order, she said in the same gentle voice. She placed a tray in front of him, on which stood a glass of brown liquid and a clay bowl of salad. In addition, there was a fork wrapped in a white napkin nearby. Thank you, Galbraith said with some disappointment to the girl, who immediately walked away. Yes, he thought, looking at the dishes, he shouldn't have expected anything supernatural from the absurdity that was listed on the menu. He was even involuntarily glad that under the word Jantar there was not some boiled shoe stuffed with nails, but just a regular salad. The inspector decided to start with a cocktail. Taking a sip from a tall glass, he was convinced that the combination of cognac and caramel syrup was terrible not only in words, but also in taste. Galbraith shuddered with disgust, but he did not spit out the liquid, instead swallowing it whole, comforting himself with the thought that they eat cockroaches in China. As a result, he moved the glass away from him and, picking up a fork, looked at the clay bowl. Compared to the cocktail, what was in it could be called quite ordinary food: lettuce leaves mixed with finely grated cheese and rye croutons. Yes, the vaunted Jantar was just a simple Caesar salad, only without the sauce. Galbraith, who expected the worst, involuntarily sighed with relief and began to eat. The salad was tasteless, which was obvious, without meat and sauce. Chewing dry leaves and croutons seemed quite boring, but, oddly enough, it was edible. The inspector didn't even notice how 2 minutes later he emptied the clay bowl and, wiping his hands on a napkin, leaned back on the soft sofa on which he was sitting. Suddenly Galbraith's attention was attracted by a person who, before his eyes, entered the Clarentone premises. It was a little girl. She looked like she was about 5 or 6 years old. She had large, gentle eyes and a head of thick golden hair, which contrasted strongly with her pale face. She was dressed in a gray woolen sweater that reached her knees and a skirt of an undetermined dark color. In her right hand she was holding a waffle cone with 2 light blue scoops of ice cream. The delicacy gave her whole figure fragility and a certain touchingness. The baby girl walked uncertainly through the hall, looking around from time to time, as if looking for someone. She didn't even look in Galbraith's direction, but she raised her head several times. Apparently she was looking at the toys hanging from the ceiling. Finally, she walked up to the counter and stopped, fascinated by the figurine of a goldfish swaying on a thin thread. The girl had her back to the inspector, so he did not see her face, but he noticed how the child extended his hand towards the toy. Then a girl with high chest, a waitress, approached his table. Bowing to Galbraith, she placed the open leather accountant in front of him. He scanned the lines. The bill stated that he would have to pay about £6 for both dishes. The inspector reached into his pocket where his wallet lay. "Well, how did you like it?" asked the waitress, playfully looking at the guest. "Keep your money, and goodbye," Galbraith said dryly. Having said this, he took out money from his wallet. The waitress looked intently into his eyes, and, collecting the coins from the table, left. Galbraith got up from the soft sofa and, glancing at the little girl in a sweater who continued to look at the toy, moved towards the exit of this place. Coming outside, the inspector noticed that while he was sitting in this Vanitas restaurant, it had already become dark outside. Galbraith, looking around, felt some uncertainty. He understood that it was almost impossible for him to navigate the local conditions, but he had to somehow get to his hotel. Excitedly, he put his hand into his pocket and felt for a piece of paper. He pulled it out. Galbraith unwrapped it and brought it to his eyes. It was the same phone number that the taxi driver had given him then. "So, burn easy, I'll have to resort to your services," the inspector said sarcastically. Still holding the piece of paper in his hands, he raised his head and saw a telephone booth on the other side of the street. Since there were almost no cars on the street at that time, it was easy for Galbraith to cross the road and pull the door towards himself. A few more seconds, and the inspector was already standing next to the telephone. Having dropped the coin into the slot, Galbraith, checking the piece of paper, dialed the number 020-1805-1982 and raised the receiver to his ear. First he heard long beeps coming from the receiver. Then there was a click in it, after which a sleepy male voice was heard, slightly distorted by interference. "Hello, I am listening to you." The inspector was quite surprised to hear this voice, which belonged to none other than his old friend Lieutenant Nilsson. "Nilsson, buddy, is that you?" At the sound of a familiar voice, a shiver of joy ran through Galbraith's body. "Galbraith? At long last it's you," a young voice responded cheerfully. "I was beginning to worry. Where've you been?" "In London, as you know." Galbraith fell silent. "What's wrong, cat got your tongue?" Nilsson asked somewhat impudently. "Give me the explanation," the inspector began. "How is it that I called a London taxi driver but got on a Portland police department?" "Speak softly." It seemed that Nilsson missed the words of his interlocutor deaf ears. "Somebody might hear us." "I'm fine not caring about," Galbraith said with some resentment, but the young lieutenant interrupted him. "Do not contest me," a young voice said rudely. "The information I will give you is not for prying eyes." "All right," the inspector gave in to his friend's pressure. "What do you want me to say?" "Couple of news," the lieutenant answered with a sense of importance. Well, according to tradition, firstly, Galbraith wanted to say good, and then bad, but he was not allowed to finish. "If you find something good in any of this news, then I can congratulate you on being such a catagelastic." "What?" the inspector asked, who had never encountered this word, in bewilderment. "It doesn't matter," Nilsson again avoided answering. "May I begin then?" "Okay, let's go," he encouraged his interlocutor. "Good, then listen to me," the voice answered with a sense of importance. "Do you remember Jordan Thurlow?" "How can I not remember? I personally interrogated him," Galbraith said somewhat offended. "Of course, all know this already," the lieutenant said reproachfully. "As well as the fact that after the audience with him you were not at all interested in his fate." "Oh," sighed the inspector. Nilsson's words were fair. Galbraith, having received from Mr. Thurlow information about Delia Yonce, actually completely forgot about this person, because it seemed to him that there was nothing to even remember about some lawbreaker who would be released only after 16 years. For the inspector, the perpetrator was something like a plant in a pot. He sits in one place, does not do anything. Only, unlike a plant, the criminal has no charisma. Basically, the day after you said goodbye to him, the lieutenant interrupted Galbraith's thoughts. A prison guard entered Jordan's prison cell and found him lying prone on the floor. He was dead, the inspector guessed. Yes, Nilison answered dryly. I wonder why he's so fast kicked the bucket, Galbraith expressed his thoughts out loud. A forensic examination determined that Jordan's death was due to oxygen deprivation of the brain, as if reading from a piece of paper, a young voice said. His interlocutor thought. Leslie Watmo, the pathologist who performed the autopsy on the prisoner's body, discovered something interesting. The lieutenant returned to his familiar tone. And what? Galbraith perked up. He discovered a malignant tumor in Jordan's larynx, Nilison answered, lowering his voice. Laryngeal cancer, in a few words. Hearing this, Galbraith involuntarily remembered the phrase of the twitchy parlourmaid from State of Snow Lake that the old concierge was taken to the hospital on suspicion of cancer, but Nilison continued to talk. In general, Leslie said that this is a rather rare case, because usually people get this disease by the age of 50, and Jordan, as you remember. I'm aware of that, Galbraith interrupted the lieutenant. That's all? That's it with Jordan. Now about Delia. It seemed as if the invisible interlocutor smiled. What, her too? The inspector was surprised. No, who would have thought of digging her out of the grave? Having said this, the lieutenant burst into laughter. All right, knock it off. For some reason it was unpleasant for Galbraith to hear this. Okay, Nilison immediately stopped. It's like this, as you were preparing to board the plane, we continued our investigation. No, really, Galbraith was involuntarily surprised. I thought all had shelved on this case. Do not interrupt. We discovered that after the hysterectomy surgeons extracted something from her womb, the lieutenant stopped as if catching his breath. So what did they extract? The inspector was a little tensed by this pause. Caitlin Armour called this thing as fetus papyraceous. According to her, this is when a female twin carries a second embryo inside. Stupid and unscientific bullshit, Galbraith involuntarily cursed dirtily. Well, what do you want from this modern medicine? The lieutenant seemed to be thinking about something. All right, they found it, so what's next? The inspector was burning with impatience. In short, they donated it to the Oregon College of Oriental Medicine, Nilison replied. Wait, what's this for? Galbraith was involuntarily surprised. As a medical exhibit, what did you think? The young voice chuckled. Nothing of the kind, the inspector stopped mid-sentence. There, of course, this thing was immediately placed in a glass vessel with formaldehyde, the lieutenant began. And when I learned about this, I did not restrain myself and immediately went to this college. What did you see? The Galbraith was very interested at that second. Well, his interlocutor began to remember. Lots of students crowded around the vessel. Do not feed bread, just let them peek at new wonderment. Quite curious, Galbraith grinned. They stood around and discussed it, continued the lieutenant. One guy noticed that this thing looked a lot like the larva of Rosalia longicorn, and someone fainted. Who exactly? For some reason the inspector was interested in this fact. Two young gals, the invisible interlocutor clicked his tongue. Apparently they were afraid that when they got pregnant, something like this would grow inside them. Galbraith involuntarily thought that it turned out quite ironically. The girl was saved from the parasite, which everyone admires, but no one even thinks about the one from whom it was extracted. There is not even a question of sympathy. God's got a sick sense of humor, the inspector said gloomily into the phone. I didn't understand. What are you trying to say? The lieutenant said in bewilderment. Forget it, I was just thinking out loud, Galbraith said honestly. But what was this thing anyway? You know, I think Caitlin Armour named this thing fetus papyraceous on the spur of the moment because it didn't look like an embryo, the young man spoke mysteriously. So what could it look like? His interlocutor did not understand. Let's imagine a sea urchin, the lieutenant began to explain. Shell, Galbraith interrupted him. No, alive, the young man corrected him. Well, I did, the inspector hastily answered. Galbraith drew in his mind a red ball, studded with long needles, which could only exist at the bottom of the ocean. So, this ersatz sea urchin swam there in formaldehyde, Nilisen said. And I, looking at this, thought that it was parasite, Galbraith suggested. Worse, the interlocutor answered. The parasite is still a separate organism, harmful, but if desired, it can be removed without loss to the host, but here. Don't stir things up, please, the inspector suddenly wanted this conversation to finally end. Imagine, my friend, that when you were conceived, a second brain formed in your lungs, a young voice deviated from the topic. What nonsense, Galbraith was surprised by this analogy. Listen to this, the lieutenant said angrily. It would be a completely useless appendage that would absorb the excess energy of your body, but it would not do anything useful. I have no idea, but that was really interestingly, the inspector remarked sarcastically. But since you have this from birth, you think that this is the norm, Nilisen continued. Galbraith thought that there was some logic in this, after all, a person really cannot know that others actually feel about their organism. And therefore, said the lieutenant, trying to remove this organ can lead to serious complications because your body. Are you saying that the chances of Delia surviving were zero? The inspector immediately asked. With this thing inside, I don't know, a young voice answered calmly. But it is a fact that removing of it led to death. Poor girl, Galbraith sighed sadly. But I can say one thing for sure, continued Nilisen. Even if she wanted to, a girl as an adult could not conceive and bear a child. The inspector scratched his mustache. Do you think that if you have some kind of thing grown into your womb, then there will be a place for the baby there too? The young lieutenant suddenly became angry. I wouldn't think such a thing. Galbraith was slightly hurt by these words. Okay, let's end the conversation, changing his tone, the lieutenant said. I am afraid that the call may be intercepted by inquisitive gentlemen from the Metropolitan Police Service. After these words there was a click and beeps started. Nilisen ended the call. In the silence that reigned, Galbraith sighed with some relief, and, wiping the sweat on his forehead, hung up the telephone receiver. Opening the door, he walked out of the phone booth onto the street and took a deep breath of the damp evening air. He thought that if anyone was interested in this telephone conversation, it most likely would not be the police, but the Maudsley Hospital. Moreover, as he believed, this would be completely fair. Recently the inspector had experienced such events that if he tried to describe them to a stranger, this could cause him the most serious suspicions regarding his mental health. Yes, Galbraith thought, falling into the hands of doctors from the Maudsley Hospital would not be such a bad idea. If such an event actually happened, he would most likely be guaranteed silence, soft walls, white coats. Standing at the telephone booth, he suddenly noticed that on the opposite side of the road, next to the newsstand, was standing the same young man in a red shirt, looking like a Japanese pop star, whom Galbraith had seen this morning under the hotel window. At first, the inspector involuntarily panicked, his breathing quickened and his heart began to pound, but then he remembered the good old trick, the essence of which was that you should not show the person watching you your fear, so that he does not become convinced that he can influence you. And then Galbraith, straightening his shoulders, boldly moved towards the restaurant, thinking about how to get to his hotel. He imagined how he would stand for a long time in the cold air with his arm outstretched in front of him in order to attract the attention of passing cars. To his surprise, as he approached the front of Clarendon, he noticed that there was a yellow car parked right in front of the doors. Galbraith quickened his pace and, raising his hand, shouted to the driver to wait. Approaching the car, he leaned towards the glass. The driver looked at him in surprise. Queensborough Terrace, Hotel State of Snow Lake, Galbraith said hastily. The man nodded without further ado, and the inspector opened the door, leaned back in the back seat, after which the driver turned the ignition key and the car moved smoothly, drove out onto a wide street and rushed forward, towards the center. Galbraith simply looked at the views of the night city flashing outside the window, without indulging in any thoughts. He noticed that the streets gradually became wider, the houses around became higher, illuminated shop windows and billboards began to appear outside the window, on which flashing colorful inscriptions flashed, calling on random passers-by to visit this or that shopping center, go to a bar and order there a glass of beer, or at least buy unnecessary change at some booth. Contemplating the world of London at night, the inspector gradually calmed down and relaxed. "Listen, good sir, you'll probably have to look for another hotel." Suddenly the taxi driver's voice was heard. This remark snapped Galbraith out of the meditative state into which he had fallen. Twitching like a frightened bird, the inspector stared at the back of the driver's head. "What are you speaking about?" Galbraith asked with uncertainty. "It's best you take a look for yourself." The man waved his hand in front of him. The passenger moved closer and, squinting, began to peer into the windshield. They had already left for Queensborough Terrace and were already approaching their destination, but what the inspector saw involuntarily threw him into a consternation. The four-story building State of Snow Lake was on fire. The flames engulfed the first 2 floors of the building and gradually reached the roof. "Well, for heaven's sakes," Galbraith thought to himself. For a couple of moments, he admitted to suppose that it was the work of that twitchy parlourmaid. This blithering idiot apparently accidentally placed the heater next to the curtain. This hypothesis arose from him because he had no doubt that all the hotel equipment in the State of Snow Lake was in the same condition as the room that he happened to rent from them. Short circuit, spark, and that's it, he thought nervously. "Stop the car." Barely containing his excitement, he shouted to the driver. "What's the use, good sir, your things are probably already burned." With some reluctance, the driver pressed the brake. The inspector was not going to argue with the taxi driver and quickly opened the door. But before he jumped out into the street, the driver turned back to the passenger. "I'll wait for you here, otherwise you never know, you'll need to go to the airport or depot," he said in a conspiratorial tone. Already getting out of the car, Galbraith involuntarily remembered the mysterious taxi driver, who, judging by his business card, had the name H. Berneasy. It seemed to him that both drivers had something in common, at least the intonation and timbre of their voices. But he had no time to think about it, and he moved towards the hotel. In the darkness of the night, the building of State of Snow Lake literally glowed in the gloom, and therefore it was not difficult for Galbraith to immediately notice the people crowding around the scene of the incident. The inspector wanted to ask someone from the crowd how long ago the fire had started, and he began to peer into the faces of the onlookers. He himself could not explain exactly what criteria a person who could be a guest of this hotel had to meet. After a couple of minutes of searching, Galbraith's gaze settled on an obese man in a lilac shirt. He looked to be about 35 years old. For some reason, the inspector was attracted to this person. Apparently, the point was that in appearance he was somewhat similar to himself. The stranger had the same black the painter's brush mustache and slightly wavy hair. Galbraith ran up to this man, who, looking at the burning hotel, was smoking a thick cigar with a kind of detached look. "Please forgive me," the inspector addressed him with respect. The man turned his head slightly towards Galbraith and blew out a cloud of tobacco smoke. "I hope he won't mind." The policeman got nervous. "Where's the fire team?" Galbraith asked a leading question. "They is right there." The man in the lilac shirt took a drag and waved his hand to the side. The inspector looked where the onlooker pointed. And in fact, there were 2 red fire trucks parked outside the State of Snow Lake. People in black uniforms with green stripes on their sleeves scurried around and tried to cope with the fire consuming the building. "You don't know when the fire started?" Galbraith sent another question. "I'd like to know more about this," the man exclaimed with annoyance and blew out a ring of smoke again. Galbraith stood next to this smoker and, involuntarily inhaling the smoke of his cigar, thought about exactly who was responsible for this accident. The version with a faulty heater seemed too banal. As a police inspector, it seemed to him that behind the fire there was clearly a certain person who was pursuing some of his own goals. Of course, thoughts of Dr. Baselard immediately entered his head. Why not, thought Galbraith, standing next to a mustachioed obese man. In the morning there was a visit from a suspicious specialist who, after checking that I was definitely staying at this hotel, gave a sign to Baselard and he took care of the fire. Although no, this is some kind of paranoia, he concluded. Alas, what a shame, the silence was broken by an onlooker in a lilac shirt. I paid about $4,500 for half a month, all inclusive. Wait a minute, you are an American, having heard that the interlocutor named the price in dollars. Galbraith perked up. I'm from Toronto, answered his interlocutor. I came here to spend my vacation, only 2 days left before returning to Canada. Thanks for the reply, the inspector said calmly. That is, you don't know how many people are trapped there? With these words he nodded towards the burning building of State of Snow Lake. I don't care about them, the obese man said dissatisfied. I just went out for a walk before dinner, came back, and then this. Having uttered these words, the onlooker in the lilac shirt angrily threw the cigar to the ground and trampled the fag end with force. An typical American, thought Galbraith. Personal happiness is everything, don't care about the rest of humanity. Some unfinished supper is more important for this tourist than the lives of the people who died in the fire. The inspector didn't think about at all that the Canadians, because this man, according to him, was from there, are proud that they are not Americans. Because for Galbraith, born in England, both these countries were one. Now, because of these dullards, I will have to contact the embassy to have my burned documents restored, the obese man said in a fallen voice and trudged up the street. Looking after person in lilac shirt, Galbraith remembered that he himself also left his things in the room. He checked his pockets, thank God, he managed to take his wallet and visa this morning. Having calmed down, he noticed with some surprise that of all the things he had left at the hotel, he was sorry to lose only materials on the Farkraut's case investigation. Mr. Galbraith, suddenly someone's insinuating voice was heard from behind. Hearing his name, the inspector immediately turned around. Standing behind him was an elderly man of small stature, in a black uniform and with a uniform cap. On his shoulder hung a large leather bag, emblazoned with a brass label Royal Mail. Sorry, you talking to me now? He asked the postmaster. It was somewhat unexpected for the inspector to hear his name from a complete stranger, and the fact that it was the postmaster made Galbraith somewhat tense, because he could not imagine who could send him a letter here in the capital of England. I was ordered to deliver the envelope to Mr. Galbraith, who was staying at the State of Snow Lake Hotel, the man in uniform began in a dull voice. But how did you recognize me? The inspector asked incredulously. Recognize? I just asked, his interlocutor answered calmly. With these words, the postmaster opened his heavy leather bag and began to rummage through it. Well, give me the parcel then, said Galbraith and looked around nervously. Before that, postmaster took something out of the bag. You must write a receipt for delivery. Okay, if you must, just give me a minute, the inspector shrugged his shoulders. Taking the paper and pen from the postmaster's hands, he began to look for where to sign. While he was doing this, his interlocutor, exuding some kind of solemn aura with his very appearance, stood motionless nearby. Here you go, Galbraith soon returned the receipt and pen to the postmaster. The man in uniform put them in his bag and, taking out an envelope from there, without further ado handed it to the stunned inspector and, turning around, disappeared into the darkness of the night. Having received the unexpected parcel, Galbraith brought it to his eyes and began to examine it. Galbraith noted that there was not a single mark or even a stamp on the thick white paper that made up the envelope. It seemed as if the postmaster had handed the inspector not a real letter, but an element of theatrical props. The only thing that cast doubt on this was that the contents inside could be felt through the envelope. Hey, good sir, a hoarse shout was heard. Galbraith, who was about to open the parcel, involuntarily shuddered. It turns out that it was a taxi driver who was standing next to his car and, leaning on the door, holding a smoking cigarette in his hand. The inspector was able to get a good look at his face. The man had a short cropped head, sharp cheekbones and a straight nose stood out clearly on his tanned face. His brown eyes looked at the policeman almost with a fatherly reproach. Galbraith did not perfectly remember the exact features of the mysterious H. Bernays, but taking the opportunity to take a good look at the taxi driver standing in front of him, he noticed that he was still completely different from the bald and old man who took him to the Vanitas restaurant. "What's the matter?" Galbraith asked calmly. The taxi driver blew a smoke ring from his mouth and flicked the ash off his cigarette. "Mr. Foreigner wants to go to the airport or depot now." The man turned to him slyly. "Huh, where is this coming from?" The inspector was somewhat outraged that some taxi driver should know better what he needed to do. "What else can you do if your hotel burns down?" "Unless you go to another," the taxi driver began to explain. "Wait, let me to get my thoughts together," Galbraith interrupted him and turned away. For some reason, the inspector was unpleasant in this man's gaze, but he could not help but notice that there was common sense in his words. With his arms crossed over his chest, Galbraith was lost in thought. This completely random London taxi driver, without knowing it, presented him with a difficult dilemma. Its essence was that the inspector had to decide whether he would capitulate in his mission to capture Dr. Baselard, or whether he would continue it to the bitter end. The second option was definitely more difficult, since Galbraith had little chance of finding one unnoticed person hidden in the wilds of the megalopolis. While the inspector was deciding what to do, the taxi driver had already thrown the cigarette on the ground and was getting into the car. "Well, good sir, think faster, otherwise I'll leave and you'll have to get where you need to go yourself," sitting behind the wheel, the taxi driver shouted from the window. Galbraith turned around and walked towards the car. He didn't want to let go of this car. Not even because it was so difficult for him to catch another taxi, no, he just subconsciously wanted to lean on someone he knew for at least a little more than a couple of seconds. The inspector felt the situation getting increasingly out of control. When he reached the car, he opened the door and climbed into the back seat. "You don't know where Makoto Computerization Institute is located?" he asked the driver. He did not remember the address indicated on the business card, only this unusual name left a mark on Galbraith's memory. The taxi driver, hearing the passenger's words, wiped the sweat from his forehead and sighed. Apparently, he was trying to understand what the inspector was talking about. "Good sir" apparently means Montec. After a minute of silence the man asked. "What kind of place it is?" Galbraith heard this word for the first time. There was such an electrical engineering plant, then its owner changed and it was converted into a research institute of electronic technologies, explained the taxi driver. "Well, I think I should go there," the inspector said with some uncertainty. He remembered that the mysterious morning visitor introduced himself to him as a computer technology specialist, so, putting two and two together, it turned out that the taxi driver indicated the right place, but under the wrong name. "I didn't even know it was renamed," the taxi driver said meanwhile, turning on the ignition. "I believe that they left a trademark familiar to people." When the car finally started moving, Galbraith leaned back in his seat. He made the decision to go to this institute in the heat of the moment. This same taxi driver simply did not give him enough time to think. But the inspector noticed to himself that this action made sense, because if that specialist was actually affiliated with Dr. Baselard, then Galbraith had a fairly good reason to visit this mysterious place. "Who knows," he thought, "maybe that's there I can complete my mission." Be that as it may, he did not have a plan for further action. He did not know what exactly he would do upon arrival at this institute. Events developed so quickly that the only thing he could count on was luck. If only because it is not a fact that if he arrives there, he will be able to find Dr. Baselard there. But what if luck smiles on him and the person he is looking for is actually located there? The inspector imagined how, seeing the doctor in the corridor, he approached him and declared in an authoritative voice, "In the name of the law, you're under arrest." And Baselard, looking at him with a gentle reproach from his small senile eyes, scratched his gray hair and answered him, "Policeman of America has no power here in England, so you have no right to imprison me." And, grinning, he will go about his business in some office, leaving Galbraith standing in place with a stupid look. Suddenly Galbraith remembered that he was still holding the envelope in his hands, which he had never bothered to open since receiving it. The inspector, who did not have scissors at hand, tore the bottom corner and tore the envelope in half. A folded sheet of paper and a small A7 sheet of cardboard fell into his lap. First, the policeman examined the cardboard. On its glossy aquamarine-colored surface there were red letters of the English alphabet in 2 rows. Each letter was respectively accompanied by a phonetic script and an index number. Galbraith was quite surprised that an unknown person sent him an item of educational equipment for a preschooler. He turned the card over, hoping that there might be something handwritten on the back, but alas, there was nothing more than a tiny inscription, "See, York Medieval Press, 1991" in the lower right corner. The first thought that arose in the inspector's head was apparently, "I was confused with the father who ordered an insert for his child for study," but he immediately discarded it. He remembered how the postmaster clarified that the letter was intended specifically for Galbraith, who was staying at the State of Snow Lake. True, it could turn out that in that hotel his namesake and a small child actually stayed in one of the rooms, but the inspector decided not to develop this topic and began to study the second item, which was in the envelope. Unfolding the sheet of paper folded in 4, Galbraith immediately noticed that the text was typed on a typewriter. Well, of course, he thought, this is a great way to put it in a deadlock. If the letter had been written by hand, it would not be difficult to guess who its author was. Having dealt with the first impression, the inspector examined this item a little more closely. Both sides of the white sheet of paper were occupied by a long epistle printed in very small print. The black ink had peeled off in many places, making the letters look washed out and the text not very legible, but Galbraith, whose job it was to decipher obscure handwritten messages, did not see anything difficult in understanding the typewritten document. For a middle-aged naive was at the very beginning of the letter. For some reason, the inspector immediately guessed that it was addressed specifically to him, and, slightly offended by the definition of naive, began reading. "I won't call thou by name, because it's obvious that missive are intended only for thou." This is how this epistle began. "Huh, why don't you introduce yourself then?" Galbraith whispered with only his lips so that the taxi driver would not hear him. "Thou behave like a juvenile in love, and, thou know, watching Amour sufferings from the outside is quite unpleasant. Honestly, it's annoying. I happened to observe in the old days 2 people who had feelings for the same person. All 3 were the same age, and they were connected by the fact that the 3 of them went to the same seminary. Why should I know about some love story between 3 schoolchildren?" Galbraith sarcastically asked the unknown author of these lines. The first stripling, let's call him Parthenian for short, fell in love with a demoiselle, let's call her Eudoxia, from early childhood. He watched her every step, worshipped her like a goddess, but at the same time he was afraid to approach her, avoided her glances and was ashamed when strangers uttered her name. While the second stripling, Andronicus, became interested in Demoiselle as an adult, when their studies at the seminary were coming to an end. He, unlike Parthenian, did not hesitate and, during the holidays, took advantage of the opportunity and retired with Eudoxia in her home. After this, Andronicus was expelled from seminary in disgrace, but he and Eudoxia had a child. The birth of an successor fully compensated for the fact that his father was left with an incomplete education. "Well done, what can I say?" Galbraith remarked sarcastically. "If thou were unable to make the connection between this story and your current situation, then please forgive me for not taking into account your level of knowledge and your intelligence quotient." Now this is rudeness. The inspector barely restrained himself from screaming. "Therefore, I will allow myself to do thou a favor, since I consider thou an experienced person who can solve the challenge if given a few clues." "What, first you insulted and then flattered?" Galbraith was increasingly affected by this letter. "The main reason why I made concessions is that I am sick of watching a grown man of the criminal profession tremble over the case assigned to him, just as Parthenian was afraid to approach Eudoxia. Thou, like that stripling, lose your footing when thou mention the victim, because of which instead investigation thou are actually doing is treading water." Interesting association, thought the inspector, gradually calming down. "But all thou need is to boldly face danger, not be afraid to make sudden movements and not take into account difficulties, like the second stripling. In this state of affairs, thou, like Andronicus, would get what thou want. In his case it was the successor, in yours a sense of accomplishment. Alas, unfortunately, thou art unlikely to be able to do this. A person's character cannot be changed by moralizing advice. All that will change is the amount of his knowledge, but otherwise he will remain the same. Of course, people never change, Galbraith recalled the famous saying. So I'll end by reminding thou of what thou should have learned all this time. In the beginning was the number twice, the 4 and the 5. From now on, I'll just hope that thou can solve the puzzle, which can cope with even those people who have serious problems with arithmetic and logic. On this somewhat contemptuous and arrogant note, the letter has come to an end. Galbraith crumpled up a piece of paper and threw it out the side window of the car. With his peripheral vision he managed to notice how a gust of breeze picked up the letter and carried it somewhere into the dark expanses of the night highway. Leaning back in his seat, the inspector thought for a split second that this was not the act of a policeman who was obliged to keep material evidence, but of an excited romanticist. In any case, Galbraith didn't care much about this, nor did he care about the fact that when he lowered the window, an unusually cold wind blew into the car. The inspector began to analyze who could be the author of this ambiguous and unclear message. It would be difficult to identify the person for sure from the typewritten text, so the inspector had to rely on the contents of the letter. It was clear as day that the creator of the lines, who did not introduce himself, was aware of who Galbraith was. In addition, this mysterious person somehow incomprehensibly knew how the inspector felt about his investigation. The phrase regarding the reaction to the victim's name clearly hinted at this. Galbraith immediately rejected the version with Dr. Baselard, because he was tired of throwing wood into the fire of his paranoia. Instead, he hypothesized that the letter could have been written by none other than Mr. Chief Inspector Scaymore. There was always some kind of secrecy in his person, and this was not limited to his manner of speaking in riddles. Take, for example, his unexpected visit to Galbraith's apartment. The inspector remembered one of the last lines that ended the letter. In the beginning was the number twice, the 4 and the 5". Reference to Gospel of John, as Galbraith thought, it was deliberately inserted by the author of these lines, so that against their background, the inherently modest numbers would look pretentious and intriguing. Well, 4 and 5, he repeated. Wonder what that's about. Trying to calm down and collect his thoughts, Galbraith lowered his hands to his knees and only now discovered that all this time the same cardboard that was in the envelope along with the ill-fated letter had been lying on them. The inspector grabbed it and brought it to his eyes. He's already seen what's on it. Were listed the letters of the English alphabet in 2 rows, under the huge red letters of which there were numbers in small print, index numbers. Then, as soon as he opened the envelope, it seemed to him like a funny mistake by the postman, but after reading the letter, this modest accessory of a preschooler acquired a strange and meaningful significance in the inspector's eyes. Galbraith was so engrossed in his little investigation that he didn't even notice that at that time the radio was playing in the cabin, which the driver turned on so as not to drive in dead silence with a taciturn passenger. Only when Galbraith began to look at the children's alphabet did the words that were heard from the speakers reach his ears. Hello. Now you are listening to my double broadcasting service. Announcer Gerard is with you. The voice of a mature man spoke with a Swiss accent. The inspector could not help but notice that this odd Gerard spoke with such glee, as if this announcer had just returned from some kind of feast and had not yet completely sobered up. But most likely, it was simply difficult for him to hide the joy that overwhelmed him, which was felt in his every word. But why? Galbraith, who involuntarily became curious about this, listened to the radio more closely. It's no secret that yesterday, the 26th of December 1991, Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union adopted a declaration on the demise of Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Our radio station believes this is a day of the great triumph for all. The announcer's voice was drowned in the noise of applause and joyful screams of the crowd. It was obvious that salute had started in the studio. Galbraith even thought he heard the pop of a cork and the hiss of foam. Apparently, someone opened a bottle of champagne right next to the microphone. But this festival of life was put to an end by the taxi driver, who on this cheerful note reached out to the radio receiver. "Smile nice, Mr. Capitalist," he said, addressing someone unknown. The taxi driver didn't finish his sentence, he simply switched the radio channel and took the wheel. The sounds of jazz were heard inside the car. However, the inspector, who managed to hear the news, was involuntarily stunned. The point was not that he was worried about the fate of some state. Galbraith was amazed that, according to the announcer, today was the 27th of December. "It's only mid-October now," the policeman puzzled muttered to himself. He couldn't understand what had happened. Is that really time flown faster for no apparent reason and ended up jumping ahead 2 months at once? This is clearly someone else's mistake, the rational inspector repeated to himself. He had 2 assumptions about this. The first was that it was possible that announcer Augerard had misspoke when he announced the date. Galbraith rejected this idea immediately. He rightly believed that it was unlikely that the radio would so blatantly misinform its listeners, passing off black as white. The second hypothesis that the inspector put forward was that it was a trick of the taxi driver. If this were really the case, then it would be outright paranoia. Why would some random driver suddenly gather a bunch of people in one room, give them pieces of paper with a script and, having recorded it on some audio cassette, put it in the tape recorder of his car and play it at the right moment to the right passenger? Against this assumption was the fact that Galbraith clearly saw that the driver had switched the radio and not pressed the tape recorder button, unless it was an optical illusion. Anything, of course, could have happened, but the inspector did not consider himself the navel of the earth around which the whole world revolves. Galbraith decided not to torment himself with meaningless guesses and turned to the driver, who, after changing the radio channel, continued to drive the car in silence. "Sorry, can you tell me what date it is today?" he asked politely and even meekly. This simple and innocent question caused an unexpected reaction in the man. He instantly turned around and stared at his passenger. Galbraith involuntarily staggered back. It seemed to him that the taxi driver had suddenly gone crazy and was about to tear him into pieces. But the next second the driver realized what was going on, and he smiled widely. "Ah, good sir, you look so intelligent, but," he began. "What do you mean?" Galbraith's fear gave way to discontent. "I'm talking about the fact that it's not proper for a man like you to drinking into oblivion," the man said reproachfully. "How do you figure that?" the policeman frowned. "How else did you manage to forget that today is December 27th? The taxi driver winked and finally turned to the windshield. "You have got to be kidding me," this answer stumped Galbraith. "Nothing of the sort," muttered the taxi driver. "Check it out for yourself, if you do not believe me," and he made a gesture with his left hand. The inspector, who had already lost his temper, obediently followed the man's instructions and looked out the side window. They were driving along a straight road, on both sides of which stretched snow-covered fields, behind which rare buildings were barely visible. The only source of light was the headlights of the car, which illuminated the road ahead, and in their light it was clearly visible how rare snowflakes were swirling in the air and slowly falling onto the snow-covered asphalt. Galbraith was confused and grabbed his head with both hands. The view of nature outside the car window silently made him understand that there was only one way to explain what was happening. A miracle happened, and the policeman inexplicably moved in time. In this regard, he suddenly remembered that in childhood he had come across a book, a collection of fantastic stories. There were a lot of interesting things there, but he remembered one story for a long time. As far as Galbraith could remember now, it was about students who found a broken grandfather clock in the house of an elderly relative. Taking them with them, they showed them to the professor and he decided to have them. His actions caused the trinity of them to travel back in time to the 80 Years' War. Over the years, the inspector forgot the author of the story, its title, and almost all the details, but the fact that in this work, from the 19th century, which was more or less familiar to his perception, the action was suddenly transferred to the 16th, was imprinted on his memory. Galbraith raised his eyes to the ceiling. All the impressions he had experienced that day made him dizzy. Common sense told him that fantastic is fiction, but now he was in reality. If someone outside tried to briefly describe what had just happened to him, the result would be complete nonsense. the inspector got into a taxi in the fall, and winter immediately set in outside. How the most ordinary and banal passenger car was able to travel forward 2 months in time. The inspector was brought out of this frantic whirlpool of thoughts by a familiar tenor. Galbraith turned away from the window and listened. The voice sang to the accompaniment of jazz, which was heard from the radio. The passenger could not resist touching the driver on the shoulder. "Listen, these are not," and Inspector uttered 2 words that sounded like the name of a French fashion magazine. "Yes, that's them," the driver nodded affirmatively, who also seemed pleased to listen to this song. Did they really release a new album this year? Galbraith was surprised. He remembered that these guys were so busy touring that they simply did not have time to get together in the studio and please their loyal listeners with another full-length masterpiece. "What, the album?" said the driver. "Only 1 track. The policeman scratched his chin. "But this is not just an ordinary composition," the driver began to clarify. "It's a song for the new movie by Ernst Wilhelm Wenders." Galbraith had never heard of this man before. Apparently, he was simply not particularly interested in what was happening in the world of cinema recently. "Okay, I was excited to learn about this," Galbraith thanked him and leaned back in his seat. He began to listen to the song streaming from the radio speaker. The beautiful voice of the vocalist had an alluring and hypnotic power, which was ideally combined with an accompaniment very similar to jazz, which was quite uncharacteristic for these guys who mostly played synthesizers. The lyrics involuntarily sunk into Galbraith's soul. As he could understand, the lyrical hero of this song felt like a stranger in the real world, and so he went to the afterlife, which he considers his true home. In the refrain he appealed to his parents, hoping for a suitable reception from them. It seemed to the inspector that this composition was clearly intended for those who were disappointed in life. Analyzing the content of a song that came across a random radio channel, Galbraith noticed its similarity to a Missa pro defunctus. "And I couldn't help but wonder, for whom does this requiem sound? According to Jordan Thurlow, a young man who had no place in this life? Maybe for Delia Yonce, a little girl who did not have time to know this world? Or in the end for himself, Inspector Galbraith, who has recently been forced to try to understand the meaning of life?" "Delia," he whispered. When the name of this girl came to his mind, the inspector was suddenly overcome with determination. He remembered the cardboard with the alphabet and, taking it in his hands, began to study it again. The letters themselves were printed in large font, and their serial numbers in smaller. How was it, 4 and 5? The inspector recalled the last lines of the letter. On the cardboard, these numbers corresponded to the letters D and E, and they, what a coincidence, came one after the other. "This is quite naturally," Galbraith grinned into his mustache. He remembered that, according to the radio, it was now December, the 12th month. He lowered his eyes again. On the cardboard this number corresponds to the letter L. Well, he became interested in solving this logical puzzle. The 9th letter from the beginning was I. Galbraith thought that it could carry the answer in itself. After all, in the Roman number system this letter corresponded to the number 1, 1. And this, by the way, was also helpful for the decision, because A, the very first letter of the English alphabet, fit this number. "Okay, this is Delia, ideal," burst out from Galbraith. The inspector tried this phrase on his tongue, and accidentally discovered that both of his last words, Delia and ideal, consisted of the same letters, only arranged in a different sequence. "One is any better than the other," he breathed. Now Galbraith had no doubt that the mysterious author of the letter had this girl in mind. But what was the point of this? An extra reminder for the inspector? An unknown author called for Galbraith to restore justice in the name of the pharmaceutist's daughter? For some reason, the policeman immediately remembered his dead friend Farkraut, who just liked to find unusual clues in things in which other people would not have noticed anything. The dead do not write letters, but the logic of his close friend and the author of the message, who wished to remain anonymous, was very similar. It is possible that the essence should be sought not in morphemic, but in arithmetic, the inspector said quietly. A hunch told him that if he added up the numbers, the riddle would be solved on its own. He was afraid of making a mistake in his calculations, so he turned to a taxi driver. "Sorry, do you have a calculator?" he said meekly. "Do you want to calculate how much money will be transferred to you in a month?" the driver said cheerfully and opened the glove compartment. Something like that. Galbraith decided to maintain a carefree tone of conversation. "If it's not a secret, what will you spend it on?" asked the driver, rummaging through things. "For the holidays, of course," the inspector answered evasively. The driver, meanwhile, continued to look for what the passenger asked him for. Finally, he pulled out a small electronic device from the very depths. "Did you ask?" "Hold it," and he gave the policeman a Casio FX 7000G. The inspector turned the silver calculator in his hands. The well-worn device had a small green screen and 5 rows of tiny buttons. "If only you knew how much money I spent on it at one time," the driver said with unexpected warmth, and for the first time notes of sadness were heard in his voice. There was no need to rush to buy the product when it was just thrown onto the market, Galbraith thought, focusing on the device. Means, Delia. The inspector checked the cardboard. It turned out that in numbers this word was transformed into 04-05-12-09-01. Galbraith began to poke at the small buttons of the calculator. "Which operation should I perform first?" he asked himself, referring to operations of a mathematical rather than criminal nature. He decided to subtract the numbers. The matte green display of the Casio FX 7000G displayed -23. A negative number meant nothing to him. Then he decided to add them. He got the number 31. Already makes sense, the inspector thought. For example, he himself was just 31 years old. What if I added up both of these answers, Galbraith decided. He typed -23 plus 31 on the calculator. The result is the number 8. 8. Delia was 8 years old when Joe met her, the policeman muttered as if in a trance. Yes, Galbraith thought, one German scientist said the truth that mathematics is the queen of the sciences. Take it back, he handed the calculator to its owner. "What, did you find out how much you will spend on the holidays?" the driver asked in a joking tone, putting the electronic device in the glove compartment. "Well, I'm a huge strapped for cash," Galbraith smiled in response. "Why so?" There was surprise in the driver's voice. "I don't really want to work," the inspector lowered his gaze in embarrassment. "All right, I get it, you are lost the grip," the driver nodded understandingly and returned to the controls. And Galbraith, who was somewhat tired from solving mathematical riddles, leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. Already without a calculator in his hands, he simply turned over the number 31, for fun. The result involuntarily made him grin, because the number 13, which he came up with, was famous for generating an unhealthy excitement around itself. It's funny, Galbraith thought, when overly impressionable people are afraid of baker's dozen, not least because that at one time some quacks gave birth to a cult, which in fact was needed only to instill fear in the souls of uneducated people. And, as the inspector noted, this mission to obscurantiate the people was successful. This extremely ridiculous cult in its essence was not only not forgotten over time, but on the contrary, it penetrated into all spheres of people's lives and became as integral a part of culture as, for example, the hippie subculture. Galbraith marveled at how the people could allow their heads to be filled with such nonsense, and thought that if these quacks heard about the incident with poor Delia Yonce, then they would immediately call her a witch, hang all the mortal sins on her. In general, they would turn the story about a rare medical case into some kind of idiotic mystical fairy tale, which would only cause bewilderment to any even more or less educated person. "I can think of no worse deed than demonization of the child," Galbraith sighed sadly.